I mean, there we go. Okay, great. So like I said, I'm Natalie. I work with Extension on vegetable crops. And today we are going to be talking about crop planning. And if you didn't listen last time to Ariel Pressman, I recommended that at some point you go back and listen to his talk because this kind of goes hand in hand with that. So Ariel talked about the pros and cons of different types of markets, like choosing whether a CSA is right for you or doing more wholesale. And so this kind of builds upon that to then talk about, okay, you've chosen what you want to do. How do we actually do it? So feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll keep an eye on the chat if there's something that's not clear. You can also just like interrupt me if you want to and say, hey, can you explain that again? Otherwise, we can do questions at the end as well. So, oops, sorry, just figuring out my chat box here. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to do a quick review of different markets and why that matters for crop planning. We'll talk about choosing which crops to grow, field planning and succession planting. So actually coming up with the layout of your fields for the year, crop rotation, choosing varieties that will meet your needs. And then we're going to think through some of the logistics. So like how much seed do I actually need? When do I need to plant it? Things like that. So to start out, this is what Ariel talked about. So I'm just going to briefly go over it. But it's really important to know what your markets will be before you plant. So understanding who you're going to be selling your produce to will impact what you plant. It will impact when you plant it. It will impact how much of it you're going to plant. So these kind of three categories are the first one, farmers markets and CSAs. So with this type of business, you need to be consistently producing. So every week you need to have something to sell. Generally, you want to have a lot of variety. So you want your CSA box to be fun and interesting. You want your farmers market table to have interesting things that pulls people in. And so it's this mix of like always having enough variety and enough things to be consistently producing for your customers. That is contrasted a little bit with this next type of production. And most people will do a couple of these. Like you don't have to just choose one. You can do both. But the next level up, you could say, is small scale wholesale. So things like selling to a restaurant or maybe selling to a local school. So with these types of markets, typically you're producing more of something, generally more like sometimes more all at once, like maybe you're just going to make a couple of deliveries during the season versus producing every single week. Usually you would work that out ahead of time. And with these kinds of things, usually you want to have really good communications with your customers ahead of time. So talking right now to that restaurant to say, what kind of chili peppers do you want to buy? Or maybe they want like really special radicchio or something. So knowing that ahead of time is going to give you more information about what specifically you should be planting. And then there's this final level. And when I say level, I don't mean to imply that one of these is better than the other. It's more just kind of about the scale. So there's this final scale of larger scale wholesale contracts where maybe you're producing for a grocery store or you have a larger contract with a school where they're going to be asking for a lot of product, generally all at once. So maybe they're ordering like a few 100 pounds of carrots or they're ordering a bunch of pumpkins. So understanding these things ahead of time can help you know how much of something to plant, when to plant, things like that. So with that, that's just a little bit of overview to then transition into thinking about what should you be growing. And generally, if you have just a CSA or just a farmer's market, you're going to be growing a lot of things. But if you're scaling up at all to where you're growing something on a larger scale, it's really important to think about a few different things. So I like to frame this as a triangle. So it's a balance when you're deciding on a crop to grow at a larger scale or to really focus on between risk, how much land you have, and how much labor you have. So usually you don't have all of these things. Usually something is limited. Maybe you work off the farm is kind of far away, and so you can't get there every day. That means your labor is limited. Maybe you have a lot of labor, you have a lot of free time, but you don't have a lot of land. And maybe you have both of those things, but you don't have a lot of tolerance for risk and things going wrong. So I'm going to show you 3 charts that I made. And these are not perfect by any means. They're just kind of charts to get you thinking, where we balance some of these different things. So to start with labor, basically my colleague Marissa and I have kind of mapped out all of these different vegetables that you can grow. And I will say up front, almost all of these vegetables are like very much vegetables that people of European descent generally consume. I know that your markets may be much more diverse than this. So just want to say up front that this is a limited chart. But I think the concept is still really important to think about. So we mapped out things that take less labor and then things that take more labor on the bottom with revenue. So things that make more money versus things that make less money. So let's say you have really limited labor. You can't make it out to the farm every day or even every other day. You can only go once a week. Something that's more labor intensive, like cucumbers or high tunnel tomatoes that need to be staked really well, that need to be picked every couple of days, might not be the best choices for you. Something like herbs or sweet corn or onions might be a better choice if that's your situation. Whereas if you do have more labor available, you can get out more, be more attentive to your crops. Some of these things on the bottom might be a better fit. So we did the same thing, but looked instead at land. So if you have a lot of land, things like pumpkins, melons, sweet corn can be really good options. And of course, you can still grow these things on a small scale. You just can't produce very much of them. If you have, say you've got like 1/8 of an acre, focusing on things that can be grown really intensively, like lettuce, cucumbers, winter greens, garlic, some of those options might be a better choice. And then the third one we did, and I'm going to send these slides to Becca so you can print these out and think through them. And these might not be perfect. You might say, no, actually, I think that one, that one's not as much work as you're saying it is, or that one's more work. So you can kind of take these and think about how they apply to your situation. But this final chart is about risk. So there are some fruits and vegetables that are pretty easy to grow. Things like kale, winter greens, summer squash, that don't necessarily, like they may be a lot of work, but there aren't a lot of things that go wrong with them. There are other things like cauliflower and broccoli that can bolt. They can be off-colored. Things like melons and sweet corn that grow really well, but right when you're ready to harvest them, they can get a lot of bird damage or attract raccoons. So that risk calculation is kind of up to you and how much risk you're willing to take on. So now we're going to shift. Say you have a pretty good sense of who you're going to sell to, what types of things you want to grow. The next step is to plan out your fields. So the framework that I like to use when talking about field planning is this idea of succession planting. So making a plan for the whole season, kind of looking at it, whether you've got rows on your farm, looking at it row by row, or however you have your farm divided up, and having these basic concepts in mind. So planning your crops ahead of time, maintaining continuous harvests and cover. So often farmers will think about the spring and they'll plant things, and then after they harvest, they've got an empty field for a while. And for soil health reasons, we want to keep the soil covered. For financial reasons, often it's better to be able to kind of keep planting in that space to get as much as you can out of it. And so planning ahead whole season so that you know what's going to be in that field at a given time is kind of this idea of succession planting. So I'm going to show you an example on this next slide here. So this is my example of succession plan. And I'm treating each of these rows going the long way across the slide as a single bed. So these are some examples of succession. So let's say in this bed, I want to produce lettuce early in the season. That's a short season crop that just takes a couple of weeks. And so after I'm harvesting my lettuce, I'm going to plan to plant carrots in that bed. So then I plant carrots in that bed and harvest them generally towards the end of August. And that gives me plenty of time to plant a cover crop. So I'm going to actually write that in. One thing I hear from a lot of farmers is like, oh, I really want to plant cover crops, but I always forget about it. Or like I get into the middle of the season and I'm tired and it's kind of the last thing on my to-do list. And farmers that actively plan their cover into their succession plan tend to be the most successful at actually getting those cover crops planted. So I really like to include cover crops in these plans. Some other examples would be planting peas in the spring, following those with carrots, taking a kind of mid-season crop. So like broccoli takes about half a season. So maybe following that with beets or even a cover crop and another late fall crop like lettuce. With a lot of succession planting, so if you look at these middle two, we've got 2 broccolis in a row. A lot of the goal, or one of the goals of succession planting, especially if you have a continuous market where you're trying to have new things for your customers every single week, is you would say you want to have broccoli consistently. You could plant broccoli like a few weeks apart in each bed so that you would have a continuous supply through the season. So that's an example of what that might look like. So this is just an example to get you thinking about different ways that you can incorporate multiple things in a bed through the season and showing some ways to include cover crops. So some things to think about as you come up with your succession plans. Again, just that idea of if you have a fresh market model where you're selling through like a CSA or a farmer's market, trying to look at, I'm going to go back a slide here, like looking at the various parts of the season. So looking at May, looking at June, looking at July, and making sure ahead of time that at each of those periods in the season, you're going to have like a diverse supply of vegetables to keep your customers happy. So that consistent production is really important, and a succession plan can help you make sure that you're planning for that ahead of time. Another thing that I think is really important to think about is your workload over time. So for example, something like cucumbers requires a lot of work during the staking period and then during the harvest period. The same is true with tomatoes. So there are these times in the season where you have really busy periods where there's a lot going on. And in general, that tends to be like July through mid-August. It's this period where you're planting things still, you're weeding and you're maintaining, you're trellising and you're harvesting. So you're doing everything that you would do on a farm all at once. And so if you are maybe thinking about adding a contract with a restaurant or selling to a school, thinking about how you can stagger that so that it's happening not at your busiest time for your CSA or your farmer's market. So just trying to kind of balance out your labor so that you're not totally overwhelmed all at once. And so looking back at that chart and kind of anticipating when things are going to be requiring a lot of labor can help you to balance that out through the season. And then again, I mentioned risk before, but kind of having a sense of which crops have a history of problems can also help you to do these things listed above. So like knowing that maybe your cauliflower isn't super reliable. Sometimes you get good cauliflower and sometimes you don't. And so balancing that out with things that are more reliable, so you can make sure that even if that doesn't work out, you still have some things to fall back on. Does that all make sense? I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions. Okay. All right, I'll keep going. So this is something I'm going to talk about more with the logistics later on, but just to give you an example of what succession planting for continuous harvest might look like. There are certain crops you want to plant really often if you want continuous harvest, or if you want leaf lettuce all through the summer. You want to make sure you're planting leaf lettuce every 7 days. For beans, it's more like 10 days. For cucumbers, you would plant every 3 weeks or so. Same with kale and melons. So I'll show you some resources at the end that can help you plan all of this out. But that's another way to think of succession planting, not just as what are you going to plant after your main crop, but how can you stagger your beds and your planting to get continuous production of some of those same crops that you want to be your really steady crops that you have through the season. And then the final thing I'll say about succession planting, and I mentioned this before, but just the importance of working cover crops into your rotation. So when you have periods of the season where nothing is growing, that means that the soil is exposed. It's more at risk to runoff and erosion during big rainstorms. Those empty plots tend to get weedy. And so planting a cover crop can help to protect your soil and also help to reduce weed pressure in those fields where you're not growing anything. So we've got this resource at the bottom here, the z.umn.edu/vegetable cover crops link that goes through different options for cover crops that can fit into each of those kind of windows of time during the growing season for vegetables. All right, so let's see if we can mute. Okay, can we mute? Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so now at this point, let's say you know your markets, you generally know what crops you want to plant, you have a general plan for what you want to plant when. Now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about choosing the varieties that will meet your goal for different parts of the season. So varieties can be really important to success. So this is a picture on the top here. These are 2 different broccolis that we planted in June. And the one on the left did a lot better than the one on the right. So in general, there are a few things to think about. So one is just days to maturity. So when you're thinking about making your crop plan, sometimes you may want something that lasts a little bit longer. Sometimes you might want something that grows really quickly. So even among like standard heading broccoli varieties, for example, there are broccolis that produce a head within 50 days. Some of them take 70 days. So that's a really good thing to know as you're making your plans, just so you can factor in like approximately the right amount of time. You also want to think about heat tolerance. So the variety that you plant in the spring is usually not the variety you would plant in the fall. So this variety, the really bad looking broccoli on the right, it looks really terrible because it wasn't a heat tolerant variety. So we planted it in June and it just couldn't handle those summer temperatures, but it did great in the fall. So making sure you're paying attention to heat tolerance if you're looking at vegetables that you want to grow in the middle of the summer, and just usually on a seed packet or in a catalog for seeds, it will tell you whether it's suited best for spring or for fall production. Some things that's not relevant, the summer crops like tomatoes, peppers, things like that. But for those kind of shoulder season crops, it's really important to pay attention to that. And then also just make sure you're thinking about disease pressure, especially insect pressure can be a little bit harder to find information about, but make sure you are paying attention to the diseases that are present on your farm and looking for varieties that are tolerant to those diseases. And that's just really important because you're planning out this season, you're planning to have things available for your customers, and you don't want to have a crop failure because that interferes with the whole plan. So it's good to be really proactive and thinking about varieties that are going to help you meet that goal. So a couple of things to think about when we're comparing different types of markets. So the varieties that you would choose if you are growing for a CSA or a farmer's market might be really different from the varieties that you would choose if you're selling wholesale, like if you're trying to sell to a school. So say I am selling to a school or to a larger wholesale contract like that. Some things that I might think about are efficient harvest. So only having to go through 1 or 2 times to harvest. So really trying to minimize my labor in that process. Whereas for fresh market, I might actually prefer a variety that I have to go back and keep harvesting every couple of days that has more of like a spread out maturity, because that gives me the ability to keep harvesting from those same plants and have a continuous supply for my customers who I'm selling to every couple of days or every week. The ability to store might be important for wholesale markets. So if I'm selling carrots to Minneapolis public schools, they might not actually use them until January. And so choosing varieties that store really well might be important. Whereas if you're selling to a fresh market, your customers probably aren't as interested in storage. They're probably more interested in things like, does it taste good? Does it look good? So those like flavor and color characteristics can maybe be more important for fresh market. I put disease resistance on both sides because that's always important, but especially when you are growing more of something, like really investing in a certain crop, really focusing on disease resistance is important. Just because I guess I've seen a lot of examples where people put in 3 acres of broccoli or 5 acres of melons, and then they lose a lot of it to disease. And so there's just like more risk involved when you're putting more of your eggs in one basket, as they say. So like really investing more in a single crop. And so making sure you're choosing something that is a little bit less risky is generally a better idea. And then I also put flavor and color and attractiveness aside because those things are still important. They may just be a little bit lower on your criteria list if you're selling wholesale. So these are just a couple of examples. This is a broccoli example, and I took these descriptions directly from the seed company descriptions, just to give you a sense of things that you might look for as you're choosing varieties. So on the left, we have Monty. So the seed company description says, for those wanting to grow separate shoots of broccoli, Monty is the most reliable. You can break off the initial head, and then you'll get many shoots growing right back. So that's a great example of a variety that would work well if you are selling to a CSA and you want to keep coming back and taking cuts from that same plant. Asteroid on the right says, with excellent uniformity and good heat tolerance. We think it's good for both spring and summer. It's used for crown cut. So basically that means like just kind of one cut and then has a smooth stem for bunching. So this is a great example of something that might be a good variety if you're doing more wholesale markets or if you want to just be able to harvest once and then be done. So limiting the amount of labor you spend harvesting that crop. Here's one more example with onions. So on the left, we have juicy, sweet, regional favorite, nice as a green top onion, but not for storage. So this is a great onion to sell directly to your fresh market customers. People want tasty, juicy, sweet onions, but it doesn't store well. And so selling it to like a school or a hospital that wants to be able to use those onions into the fall probably won't work. Whereas the onion on the right says it stores for 6 months It has some disease resistance. And so those are traits that I would look for if I wanted to be selling to one of those institutions that wants to store it. All right, so now we've gone through hopefully identifying your market, identifying some of the crops you want to grow, coming up with a plan, and then hopefully being able to be specific and writing in which varieties you're going to grow at different times. And so now we're going to think a little bit longer term. So thinking not just about this season, but into the future. So we're going to talk about the importance of crop rotation and keeping good records so that you know what you planted where, so that you can make your crop plans in the future informed by the plans that you make now. So just a quick overview, crop rotation just refers to not planting the same family in the same place every year. So going from lettuce to something like carrots, to tomatoes, to broccoli, to beets. Ideally, you want to wait 3 to 4 years before you plant something of the same family in the same space. So I'm going to start with one example of why that's important. There are a few examples: nutrient management, insect management, and disease management. So I'm going to highlight disease management and why crop rotation is so important for disease management. So this is my farm field. I have planted broccoli, and this variety of broccoli is susceptible to a disease. So let's say black rot. So I have black rot in my field. Those are those little red dots on this broccoli in kind of the middle upper right, and then this broccoli towards the bottom left. So maybe it came in on the seed, maybe there were residues in the soil. It could have entered my field in a variety of ways. But if I have a susceptible variety, that disease is going to spread through my field throughout the summer. And so after I harvest my broccoli, that disease is still going to be there in the residues. Some of it will probably die over the winter, but even when I come back next spring, some of it will probably still be there. So some diseases do not overwinter here, they go away, but many of them do. They stay here in the soil and in residues. So let's say it's next year. I have this field with some disease residue in it. If I go ahead and I plant something totally unrelated that is not a host for this disease, so I'm going to plant carrots, though that disease is not going to be able to live in that soil or in that system because it doesn't have a host to consume and live out its life on. So over time, that amount of disease in the soil is going to go down. But if I come back to that field and I plant the same thing or something in the family, so it doesn't even have to be broccoli. Say I plant Brussels sprouts, or I plant radishes, or I plant pak choi. All of those things are hosts because they're in the same family. So if I come back and plant there, my disease issues are only going to get worse because those disease spores that are staying over the winter in the soil now have a source of food and a place to reproduce. So like I said earlier, the ideal crop rotation is 3 to 4 years. And so that means that we want to have really good records of what we planted in each bed and each area of our farm in order to not plant the same thing there in the years to come. And so another important piece of that then is that we have to know our crop families really well. So this is just an example of the brassica family. I think a lot of people know that like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage are related, but we also have to know that all of these other plants are related. And even sometimes like weeds in our fields are related to our main vegetable crops. So we have to be really aware of that as we're making our crop plans. So we just talked about disease management. Some other reasons it's important to do this. Nutrient management is a big one. So different types of vegetables and plants take up different amounts of nutrients, different types of nutrients. They also have different root structures, which impacts the soil and the structure of the soil. And so by rotating, we get like a more balanced distribution of what's being taken up and how the soil structure is being impacted by roots. So this final picture is just something to think about. I think a lot of people, when they think about crop rotation and diversity, do it like the picture on the bottom right, which is like a bed by bed basis. So maybe I plant my solanaceous crops, like my tomatoes and peppers and potatoes, eggplants. That could be the red, maybe the green are the brassica crops, the orange are the alliums. So often we think of it on a bed by bed basis. So I'm going to plant tomatoes this year in this one bed. So that means I'm not going to plant solanaceous crops in that bed again. And that's fine. It's good to have a lot of diversity. Sometimes I encourage people to think about maybe organizing their farm more like the picture on the left, where they plant everything from a family kind of all together in an area, because that allows you to keep better records and just like more easily remember what you've planted in a given space and have a better rotation plan. So keeping all of the vine vegetables, the cucurbits together, and then kind of planting all the solanaceous vegetables next to each other, the tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and potatoes, and then keeping the brassicas generally together. So you can choose how you want to rotate, but just in general, it's a good idea to rotate if you can. So other reasons to keep records and to have these field plans every year. So one is rotation, but also just making sure that you're taking notes of varieties that you really liked, things that you didn't like, problems that you're seeing like insects or diseases, nutrient management issues. All of these things can be really, really informative as you're making your crop plans for next year so that you can plan around them and come up with a better plan to address some of these things. So that was like a big overview of this process. And now I'm going to go into logistics a little bit more and highlight some resources that can help you with this process. So the first resource is to know what your first and last frost dates are. So if you think about that crop plan that I showed at the beginning, it has a beginning and an end basically. And those beginning and end dates should generally be your last frost date, so the last frost of the winter, and then the first frost date. There are, of course, some vegetables that can handle a little bit of a frost, things in the brassica family, some things like in the spinach family can handle some frost, but generally having those first and last frost dates in your mind is really important for helping you come up with your plan. So one really great resource to help you do that is you can go to, you can just look up DNR, Department of Natural Resources, final spring and first fall freeze and frost date. So they have a map and you would click on your spot. So at Big River Farms, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I would just pick probably the two that are closest to Big River Farms. And then it downloads a spreadsheet for you. And this spreadsheet is a little bit confusing or it's a little overwhelming, but it's really useful. So I want to walk through it. So I chose the Forest Lake Station. That was one of the closest points to Big River Farms. So we're going to look at the top part of it first. So on the left, you can see a column that says temperature. And so 32 degrees is the temperature at which it freezes. And so as we go across that table, we see the probabilities of frost. So if we go all the way to the right where it says 0.9, that means a 90% likelihood of frost, basically. So around April 22nd, there's still a 90% likelihood that it's going to freeze. If we look in the middle, around 50%, it's about May 5th, where there's still a 50% chance that it will freeze outside. So go further to the left, and most people tend to use this 10%. So this second column here. So on May 21st, there is a 10% chance that it will still freeze. And so a lot of people use that as their first date. If you are less risk tolerant, you can go even further than that and say, I want to wait until like May 27th. Then I'll be pretty sure it's not going to freeze again and I can put things outside. In the next part, you can do that same thing, but for fall. So I want a like less than 10% probability that it's going to freeze. I'm going to have September 20th as kind of my last day of the season. And again, some things you can push beyond that. Some things are fine to freeze, but for a lot of your more heat-loving crops, that's going to be the time at which they die. So setting those parameters can help you to know how many days you have in the season. And then as you're making your crop chart, you can kind of figure out the days to maturity for your different varieties and use that to build out your season. And obviously nothing is perfect. Things in nature never happen as we like specifically hope them to, but hopefully those are some really like useful dates to at least plan around. Let's see, I got a question here. Okay. All right. So estimating days to maturity as you're looking at your different varieties, pretty much like all seed catalogs have suggested days to maturity. So here's a pak choi with 50 days. This pak choi over here has 60 days until full size. So just note those differences as you're doing your planning. And also note that they're not going to be perfect. A lot of seed companies are not in Minnesota. Most seed companies are not in Minnesota. And so these numbers may not be perfect for our climate, but they're still pretty good. So then again, just like taking that information and bringing it back to this idea of a chart, you would set the left side of your chart, the beginning of it around that last frost date, and then the end of it around that first frost date. And then you can see I just have pretty crude measurements here. So like lettuce for the month of April or of May, carrots for June and July. You can make that more specific depending on which varieties you're growing and how long they're expected to take. One note I wanted to make is that when you're planting cover crops into your rotations, if you're planting them in the fall, this is not such a big deal. But if you're planting a spring cover crop, so a lot of people will plant a cover crop before like sweet corn or tomatoes or squash, things where you want to wait until the soil is warm to plant. Some people will plant a cover crop first in the spring. And so this is just a note that you usually want to wait a few weeks, like 3 weeks or so between when you terminate or kill that cover crop and when you plant your vegetables, just to allow it to break down. So that's another timing consideration. So how much seed should you buy? I think this can be a really tricky thing to figure out. And the best resources that I know of are from Johnny's Seeds. So this is not an endorsement of Johnny's. It doesn't mean you need to buy your seeds from there. But if you look on their website, this final tab on the right, on the top, that says Growers Library is full of some really good resources. So they have resources both for direct seeding and for transplanting to help you figure out how much seed you should plant. So just to look at this first example here with bush beans, they recommend planting 800 seeds for a 100-foot row. They also have it by acre, so 116,000 seeds per acre. And then they also give you average yield estimates. So again, that's not going to be perfect for Minnesota, but it's going to be pretty good. And that can help you as you're making your plans to make sure you're kind of balancing things out so that you are providing consistent vegetables to your customers throughout the season. And then for transplants, They have a really similar table. They also, if that feels like overwhelming to look at spreadsheets, they have this really easy calculator that is based on those spreadsheets, but you can put in, like, you choose your crop. So I want beets. I'm going to direct sow. I have 100 feet. And then you can just press calculate and it will tell you how many seeds you need. So that's based on the tables, but just a nice option if you don't want to like do the math of adapting it to how much space you're growing in. Another thing that is really important to think about is that if you are planning to save seed, so a lot of farmers don't want to buy seed every year. You want to save seed and keep growing it on your farm. It's really important to plan ahead for that. So now is the time you should be thinking about seed saving. So the reasons for that are, one, isolation distance. So if you grow 2 varieties of peppers really close together, those varieties can cross with each other and hybridize. And so if you're growing an open pollinated variety of pepper and you want to be growing open pollinated varieties to save the seed, a hybrid variety, you can save the seed, but it will not, like the seedlings next year will not look like the parents this year. So if you're growing open pollinated varieties of seed, you want to make sure you have enough distance between this pepper and your other pepper, or this variety of corn and your other variety of corn, so that they're not going to hybridize with each other. And the other thing you want to make sure you have the right amount of is the actual number of plants. So if you're only saving from a couple of plants, in general, over time, you're losing genetic diversity. And so you want to make sure you have enough plants that you can keep a really healthy seed community, basically, that has enough diversity in its genetics. So Seed Savers has some really nice resources on this. They have a seed saving chart, and I put a screenshot of it here, but you can download this on their website if that's something you want to do. And it goes through a bunch of different types of crops and basically how far away you need to plant those crops from their relatives, and then the number of plants you want to have. So for variety maintenance, basically. So the final thing that I'm going to talk about, and I know this is a lot of content, but once you have your crop plan, you know what you're going to plant, you know when you're going to plant it, how much of it you're going to plant. The other things that are really important to think about ahead of time are a nutrient management plan. And I know that you all are doing that at Big River and you have support to do that. And also a pest management plan. So just making sure you have plans in place to keep your plants healthy and that you're planning ahead, because often when we have problems, it's too late to fix them. And so thinking really preventatively to prevent insect problems and disease problems and to make sure your plants have all the nutrients they need ahead of time will help you to have really healthy plants throughout the season. So that is the whole presentation. Put my email in here and my phone number, and you're welcome to reach out anytime. And I also wanted to just plug, we have a newsletter that goes out every week during the growing season. So we give updates on all the different vegetable crops, things to be looking for, problems we're seeing in the field. So hopefully trying to get ahead of some of those problems before they happen and letting people know what they should be looking for each week. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was such valuable information. I definitely learned so much through that presentation.
Great. And I'll send you the slides.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So you can all look at this stuff later too.
Yeah, those are all really great resources too. I love using that Johnny's calculator. I highly recommend farmers to use that when you're purchasing your seeds. Are there any questions? Well, if there aren't any questions, yeah, I guess we can move into our evenings. Thank you again so much, Natalie, for providing this class to our farmers.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Emilio.
Gracias, gracias.
Adios, Mario.
De nada.
Gracias. Andrés.
Bye, Emilio.
Gracias, Andrés.